Bring some signs. Yeah, get some signs in here.
Here again. All right. Yeah, you can do it. You can
is that all right?
That's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
How are you guys?
No, you don't want to get that.
Awesome.
You don't want to get that. All right.
The man is long.
Hey, Po. Hello again. All right, we got everybody here? This is an impressive crew. All right. Everybody ready? All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Murphy, and I am honored to be one of Connecticut's 2 United States senators. I'm going to try a little balancing act here. There we go. I don't do that as well as Blumenthal, but I try. It's really wonderful to be here with so many of our great friends representing the cross-section of anti-gun violence groups here in Connecticut. Thank you to everyone here from Newtown Action Alliance, from CAGV, from Moms Demand Action, from Sandy Hook Promise, and other organizations from Brady, Giffords PAC, so many other groups that do great work here in Connecticut. We are here today because this week Senator Blumenthal and I will be introducing a universal background checks bill that will make sure that every single person that tries to buy a gun in this country proves that they are not a dangerous criminal before they get their hands on a dangerous weapon. This is a proposal backed by 97% of Americans. And this year, it is going to pass the United States House of Representatives, and we are going to make sure it passes the United States Senate. Now, it is hard to get something to achieve a 97% approval rating, right? You know, puppies don't have a 97% approval rating in this country, but background checks do, because it is simply common sense that you should not be able to get your hands on a deadly weapon if you have a history of violence, if you have a history of serious mental illness. Background checks are popular because they work. In states that have background checks, there are 45% less gun crimes committed than in states that don't have background checks. That is an incredible impact from just one public policy interventions. Background checks are popular because they're easy. They take about 90 seconds in most cases to complete when you walk into a gun store to purchase a weapon. Background checks are popular because today, upwards of 2 out of every 5 gun transfers happens without a background check. Now, when the background checks bill was initially passed in 1993, almost everybody bought their guns in gun stores. But today, lots of people buy their guns online. Lots of people buy their guns at gun shows. You don't have to do background checks in those places if you are in a state that doesn't require it. Background checks are popular because they work and because it's just common sense. And the fact of the matter is they are more necessary today than ever before. Every single day, 90 people in this country die from a gunshot wound. 90 different families spiral into trauma every single day in this country. And every single one of those gun deaths is preventable. Every single one of them. And every single category is affected by the public policy that we are introducing this week. Suicides are less likely in states that have universal background checks. Gun crimes in urban neighborhoods are less likely in states that have universal background checks. Background checks work. And today, with the number of episodes of gun violence increasing in this country instead of decreasing, they are more necessary than ever before. The good news is that the political pressure is increasingly impossible for our colleagues to ignore. Last November, candidates all across the country ran for the House of Representatives based on their promise to pass a universal background checks bill. And in every corner of this country, in red states and blue states and purple states, those candidates that supported gun safety laws like universal background checks beat NRA-endorsed candidates that had voted against 90% of their constituents over and over again. I led and Dick joined a campaign called NRA 8, in which we targeted 8 seats where there was an NRA A-rated incumbent and a candidate running against them who was going to be with us on background checks. We raised almost $1 million in just a few days for those 8 races, and on election night, all 8 of those candidates won. All 8 of those NRA A-rated incumbents are no longer in office. And Lucy McBath wasn't even on that list. Lucy McBath, who won a seat in Georgia based on her own personal story of loss, was maybe the most important and heartbreaking win of election night. So I'm going to turn this over to Dick to say a few words about this initiative. But I feel like this is the year. It is going to pass the House of Representatives potentially as early as this month. It is one of the top priorities of this Democratic Congress. Dick can say more about this, but it is going to be difficult in the United States Senate. We will likely have to find about a dozen Republicans who will vote with us. But there are lots of Republicans who are on the ballot in 2020. In fact, there are twice as many Republicans on the ballot in 2020 in the Senate as Democrats are on the ballot. And if they look at what happened to their colleagues in the House who ran against background checks in swing districts, they are going to get wise to the fact that the only way they can preserve their own political future is by getting on board with this proposal this year. I wish that weren't the reason why they are going to join us. I wish they just looked at the data. I wish they just did it because it was the right thing to do. But our political movement, and you can see it behind us, is stronger today than the gun industry's political infrastructure. For the first time in my lifetime, in our lifetime, we can say that. And we are just getting stronger. And they are just getting weaker. I want to get it done this year. I want to get it done in 2019. And I'm proud that this will be, I'm proud to be the primary co-sponsor of this bill. I'm proud to introduce it this week, but of course, every single day, I'm so proud to go to work with my partner, somebody who's been fighting a lot longer than I have on behalf of the cause of gun safety, Dick Blumenthal.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here today. A busy week and a wonderful week for Connecticut, a new beginning. But Connecticut has shown over the last years, in fact, over the last decades, that it has been at the forefront of gun violence prevention. And I just want to thank everyone who was here, who has hung in there, who has enabled us to make the progress that we have over these past years and over these past decades. And in Connecticut, we have shown the political reality. Gun violence prevention is bipartisan. That 97% of the American people who are in favor of background checks aren't Republicans or Democrats, they're Americans. This cause is a uniquely American cause. And it is an example of a tipping point being reached. We have reached that tipping point when we are breaking the grip of the NRA and the special interests who have been in our way up to now on this issue. The elections are a sign of it. Gun violence prevention was on the ballot, and gun violence prevention won. Thanks to you. Thanks to the people of America. Now, we don't really need to make the case in Connecticut about background checks. Background checks save lives. We know it in Connecticut. The data prove it. But we also know that Connecticut is at the mercy of states like South Carolina and Georgia and other states where there are no background checks. Here's a news flash. Guns have no respect for state borders, right? They come across state borders. Our boundaries are porous to guns that are stolen, the so-called crime guns. The vast majority are stolen or lost or illegally sold. So we know that we are at the mercy of those states that have no background checks until we have a national background check law. That's it in a nutshell. It's pretty simple. And it's so simple that I think that our Republican colleagues are going to get it this time. They did right after Sandy Hook. We had a majority of the United States Senate voting for a background check bill. We lacked the 60 votes that we needed under the rules of the Senate. Those arcane rules that require 60 votes in order just to move forward on a bill. I think we will have 60 votes this year. I think we'll have 60 votes because of the political realities, but also because I think that our Republican colleagues are going to want to show in 2020 and beyond that they are on the right side of history, on the right side of conscience and conviction. The political realities dictate self-interest. Conscience and conviction show the moral force of this argument. And I just want to say a special word about the Sandy Hook partners and families and communities and the state of Connecticut, which has been so courageous and strong, which have come to Washington year after year, whether it's on bikes or trains or planes. You have been there at our side as we have fought. And people should make no mistake. We're not settling for background checks alone. Background checks are a beginning. They are a bare minimum. They are only a baby step in the right direction. The real steps will come when we have safe storage of weapons, when we have a red flag statute that takes guns away from dangerous people after a court order. I will be introducing both of those measures in the Congress in the coming weeks, again with the support and partnership of Chris Murphy and others. I hope those measures actually will be bipartisan. And I think that we are at a historic moment. We have a unique opportunity. It is a moment in time when we can seize this historic opportunity, beginning with background check, where there's a clear consensus, and moving forward on other measures that will really make a difference, a historic difference. And we know in Connecticut, background checks save lives. The rule should be, listen carefully, no check, no sale. No check, no sale. No check, no sale. Nobody new will be prohibited from buying guns. Dangerous criminals will be checked and barred from buying them as they are now prohibited. No constitutional rights affected whatsoever. And the rule, no check, no sale, ought to be across this country so that we in Connecticut will be protected and our state laws will be made more effective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'd be happy to take some questions. I will just add we are standing here today on a day where 1/4 of the government is still shut down, including the Department of Justice, which does much of the work to track down dangerous criminals, gun traffickers, and people who fought our existing gun laws. And so we are both heading immediately back to Washington. Our first job is to try to convince this president to stop this temper tantrum, to reopen the government so that we can get back to the business that is so desperately needed by the agencies that are shuttered today.
And we're happy to take questions on that after.
Yeah.
On this, so your numbers did dwindle, though, in the U.S. Senate. Now you're 53 in the Republicans, 47, one caucusing with you. But you also lost, well, in gaining Senator Scott, you lost Bill Nelson. And Senator Scott was okay with some of these proposals in Florida as governor. We also got Josh Hawley from Missouri, who was kind of the opposite of some of these things, as Claire McCaskill. So what do you think this means for your numbers then in the Senate, and how realistic is it that it will in fact get through Mitch McConnell?
So it's going to pass with Republican support in the House of Representatives. I think the stronger the bipartisan vote in the House of Representatives, the more pressure there will be on Republicans in the Senate. I'll be honest, if you look at the 12 or 13 votes that we would need from Republicans, we're going to probably need both Florida senators. And so we will need to find a way to convince both Rick Scott and Marco Rubio to support this legislation. It is not an easy road to get to 60 in the Senate, but it is not impossible. And I don't think you can underestimate, or I don't think you can calculate how much energy will be created by this bill passing the House of Representatives for the first time. Once the dam breaks on background checks, once people see that it is possible, once the members who voted for it go back home to applause, and the members who didn't vote for it in the House go back home to jeers and protests, senators will start to rethink their attitudes. Remember, the House has never taken a vote on background checks. Paul Ryan protected all of his members from a background check vote for 6 years. And so I just think you can't count votes in the Senate until you have had this vote in the House and had a chance for Republican senators to look at what happens to their Republican colleagues who vote the wrong way.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a dynamic here, and this bill is only one example of it. The House of Representatives is going to be passing legislation on a variety of topics, and the Senate is going to have to make a decision whether it will deal with any of that legislation. Some of the legislation will be more difficult for Republican senators than this one, a lot more difficult. If the United States Senate wants to say yes to rational legislation, saving lives and stopping violence, it will pass this measure. If the Senate wants to be, in effect, saying no, and Mitch McConnell becomes the majority leader of no, and Republican senators become the party of no, that will be a heavy burden for them in this next election. And there's no better example of legislation that has consensus support than gun violence prevention, particularly background checks. And I think the NRA is going to have to deal with reality. They are not going to be able to give their members an F for respecting the political realities here, that they cannot say no to everything.
Some people say that universal background checks would essentially be a regressive tax on guns that can add up to $100 to the cost to transfer a firearm. Any comment on that?
It's just factually wrong. I wouldn't even dignify it by a more detailed answer.
Would it add any cost to transferring a firearm?
No.
Will the details of this bill be any different than the past legislation?
So So this proposal will be similar, close to identical to the background checks legislation that the two of us introduced last year that was supported by 40 of our colleagues. It is slightly different. It is different, though, from Manchin Toomey. So I'll just say that. Manchin Toomey was the proposal we voted on in 2013. Manchin Toomey was not a universal background checks bill. Manchin Toomey would have closed the gun show loophole, but would have left lots of other transfers without background checks. So this is a universal background checks proposal, and I'll also be honest that if this comes to the floor, it is likely that we would have to have a bunch of conversations with Republicans to get their votes. But the bill we're introducing today is essentially identical to the legislation we introduced last year. It is universal, and it is also substantially identical to the legislation being introduced tomorrow in the House of Representatives. So the legislation, our bill, is a companion to the House bill being introduced tomorrow.
And just, there have been other background check bills introduced over the years. Some of them, for example, made no accommodation for inheritance or inter-family transfers, gifts within families. We're going to have to be realistic about the bill coming over from the House. Hopefully it will be as close as possible to the bill that we're introducing tomorrow. But those details, I think, are less important than the basic principle of universal background checks. No check, no sale. The selling is what's important. No check, no sale, whether it's the internet or private gun shows, no check, no sale.
You mentioned briefly about the government shutdown a little earlier. Can you comment specifically, we're talking about a blue flu, long lines at TSA checkpoints, problems with transit and travel. Can you comment on what we're going to try and do to get this government back open?
Did you fly up this morning?
I did.
With the lines?
The lines were all right this morning, so yeah.
The president has chosen to take America hostage. He has chosen to punish Americans simply because he cannot have a wall through temper tantrums and petulant fist pounding. The bottom line here is that the hardship and the harm will grow. I've talked to a lot of members of the Coast Guard over the past few days who are having to make decisions about whether they're going to pay mortgages or put food on the table. The same is true of TSA employees and FBI agents. There are really essential federal employees who are going through harm, and that harm and hardship will be for the American people as a whole. There's a clear path forward here, which is reopen the government, temporarily fund the Department of Homeland Security, while we deliberate what should border security entail. We all agree on border security. We say it shouldn't be a wall, but the government should reopen, and the American people should not be held hostage by a president who said, remember, Mexico was going to pay for it, and who has also backed off. In fact, a number of his top officials have said a wall from sea to shining sea makes no sense. In fact, a wall is unwise, impractical, wasteful. And the president has yet to spend more than 10% of the money that's already been allocated for border security this fiscal year. So he ought to spend that money rather than shut down the government of the United States of America on this insistence for a wall. We've seen no lines yet, but if the TSA employees are unable to come to work because they have to have other jobs to feed their families, we're going to see consequences at the airports.
Are you concerned about security at airports if this continues to drag on, as you say?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, at some point, you can't ask TSA officers to come to work without getting paid. I mean, they've got to put food on the table. They got to pay mortgages. They'll have to find other jobs. And so this is, and remember, the Department of Agriculture is shut down. Farmers in Connecticut aren't going to get payments. The IRS is shut down. People aren't going to get the rebate checks that they were, the refund checks that they were counting on. This is going to start to really, really hurt people as this week goes on. And, listen, if the president gets away with this, then this will become standard practice. The president will shut down the government anytime he doesn't get his way. He needs to act and behave like an adult. Reopen the government, and then we can sit down and talk about his stupid wall.
Well, we can talk about it.
Right. I didn't say anything more than talk about it. No, but I think, let me underscore a point Dick made. If the president is going to say today that there's a crisis at the border, if there was a crisis at the border, then why are you enthusiastically shutting down the Department of Homeland Security? If there was a crisis at the border, then why have you only expended 6% of the border dollars that Congress gave the administration in the last 2 years? Spend the money you have before coming and asking for more. And so the president doesn't really care about building a wall. The president just wants to keep this issue open and exposed to rile up his base. That's what this has always been about from the beginning. And we need to reopen the government. That's what we're going to be focused on this week.
But let me deal with the security issue because, the president in a letter to Congress said that 3,700 terrorists are coming across the southern border. That statistic is a total fabrication. It is a falsehood. The government's own reports say that only a fraction of that number have been encountered, and an encounter is different from an apprehension. And the State Department's latest report says the major danger of terrorists coming across our borders is at the northern border, not the southern border. So this idea that there is any number of terrorists that pose a security risk at our southern border is just total poppycock. And that's a euphemism for something that I would be remembered for saying, but not a word I want to use here. There is a crisis at the border. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's not a security crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis with children being separated from parents, with children kept in detention facilities where they're becoming sick and tragically dying, where families are kept across the border under conditions that would never be tolerated here under the so-called metering of asylum numbers. I have been to the border a number of times. It is repugnant and abhorrent to American values. It's a humanitarian crisis. But within our borders, we will soon see threats to our security because those agencies that have been shut down, essentially, like the FBI and the TSA, and even the Customs and Border Patrol, who are working but not being paid, will eventually be impacted. And our Coast Guard, I can't say it enough times, is a branch of our military. And it ought to be paid just like every other military service. And that's why I am introducing bipartisan legislation. It is bipartisan, that will require payment of the Coast Guard as a military service while the shutdown is ongoing. But, the idea that we shut down the government whenever the president wants something that he can't have because it isn't supported by the American people, that's the road to an imperial monarchy. And I will just add one more thing, speaking as a member of the Judiciary Committee, this idea that we're going to have a national emergency, that's constitutional poppycock. I will tell you that no brick, no steel girder, will be laid on the border as part of a so-called national emergency because the courts will stop the president. In fact, anybody who acts in the military under that kind of order could be criminally prosecuted under the most recent statutes. And what will happen is, by the way, if the president were to declare a national emergency, the likelihood is Congress would pass a resolution saying no, and the Senate would be required to act within 15 days, have a vote, and it would be stopped. So either the courts or the Congress will stop this so-called bogus national emergency before it is even started. And, you know, we still live in the United States of America. We still have a rule of law. We still have a Constitution. The president is not above the law. He can't simply have a tantrum and decide he's going to have a national emergency. There are criteria and rules, and they don't apply here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thanks, guys. Thank you. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for all your help.
Thank you so much for everything. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. All right, buddy. Thank you.